I wanted a title that would communicate the tone of the novel, I guess, which is sort of, I guess, a slightly unstable tone that hovers between comedy and a sort of darker, more unsettling subject matter. And also, I guess something that will be instantly recognisable for the audience that would allow them to be in on the joke when they look at the title, because we all know if someone says, "I'm sorry you feel that way," it's almost always a passive-aggressive
incredibly
kind of comment.
Yeah.
It's sort of putting the onus on you rather than, this that you feel that way is your problem and I'm not going to apologise.
Yes.
So I guess that's what I wanted the title to do. And I usually take quite a long time to think of a title, and particularly with Our Fathers, actually. I remember going back and forth for ages, long after I'd finished the book, and I couldn't work out what the title should be, and I had loads, I had a shortlist, and I wasn't quite happy. I'm kind of happy with that title now, Our Fathers, but even once it was being published, I wasn't entirely sure I'd got the perfect title. But I was pretty happy when I thought of I'm Sorry You Feel That Way, and it was quite early on in the novel, and I felt like it just did what I wanted it to.
It really just captures the essence of the book. You're dealing with topics like schizophrenia and depression and toxic family dynamics, and yet you tempered it with this humour that kind of reminded me that these characters, whilst they're dealing with these heartbreaking moments, are still quite funny and sarcastic and dry. And I don't know if that was a conscious thing on your part, or how difficult it was to strike that balance.
Something quite... I think there was a slightly strange set of circumstances when I was writing the book, which influenced the form it eventually took and the tone, and the fact that there's quite a mismatch in some ways, a deliberate mismatch between some of the darker content and some of the humour. And I sort of... I think I gave Hannah a line at some point where she says, "Do you think life is more of a comedy with some..." Now I'm misquoting myself. A comedy with some sad moments, or a tragedy with some hilarious moments. I think I might have phrased it a bit better in the actual book. But that's kind of how I think of life myself. But what I was doing in the novel is, as usual, I think when I'm writing, there's a few particular things that I've got interested in and I want to spend time thinking about. So the impact of inherited mental illnesses like schizophrenia on a family, and the idea of inherited dysfunction in a family, that kind of toxic legacy. So I was really interested in that. And then also I was writing it during lockdown. So I was about a quarter of the way in when the COVID pandemic hit. So that sort of that kind of fateful February, March of 2020, I was about a quarter of the way into the book. And I think that actually had a really big impact on the form the book eventually took, because I was writing I was going for a kind of dark comedy-ish when I first was writing it. And I remember sending it to my agent fairly early on, thinking I'd written something quite funny. She emailed me back saying, "Yeah, I've read it, it's very depressing." Put some more jokes in. But I was actually, like a lot of people, I was having a very, stressful and miserable time in the pandemic. I was worried about family members. I was locked down in this one-bed flat with my husband. Both of us trying to work. I was trying to teach on Zoom at that stage and worried about my students. And we also had terrible internet in our flat. There's a slight digression, but my husband would be trying to take work calls. And as soon as he logged on, I'd be teaching a Zoom lesson and I'd be bumped off the internet connection. So I'd suddenly just lose my class. And then I'd have to sort of log back on and try and get them all back. But they'd all wandered off by that point. And I'd be like shouting, Jack, come back to your computer. Jack, has anyone seen Jack? Can someone text Jack, please? So it was just very fraught and very stressful. And I think I had a better time than loads of people in the pandemic, but it wasn't a fun time. And I think that genuinely made my book funnier, because I was consciously, in the end, trying to kind of amuse myself as I was writing. I was having such a horrible time. And I was also thinking, I've covered some pretty dark territory in my previous novels, and everything just got kind of simplified in my head when I was writing I'm Sorry You Feel That Way during this really dark time in our country and in the world. And I just felt like I wanted the reader to broadly have quite a nice time when they were reading the book, and to want to carry on reading and to be entertained by it above all, to want to know what was happening next, to sometimes maybe crack a smile. And I think genuinely that fed into the fact that the book ended up much more of a comedy than my previous novels. I didn't want to make the reader feel depressed, which has perhaps been the case with some of my previous novels. And my American publisher actually, once, I think it was meant to be a pep talk, it wasn't very encouraging. But he was like, the reason, I'm not going to do the American accent, I thought I was for American, but now I'm going to back off. Rowing back, he said, the reason that your books get good reviews but ultimately don't sell is because no one actually wants to pass them on to their friends because they're very depressing. And this was about, I think that was about my second novel, which is called The Followers, which is about the murder in a religious cult. It is quite depressing, actually. Anyway, so I kind of had that in the back of my head, and I thought, what if I don't make the reader have a horrible time in this book? What if I just allow the reader to have an enjoyable reading experience? And I also wanted to have an enjoyable writing experience, so I just started putting in more jokes, and so the stuff that went in, I guess, was stuff that amuses me. So I find like dry comedy, like dry one-liners funny, but I also have quite an unsophisticated sense of humour in the sense that slapstick really gets me. So that's how a few of those slapstick moments kind of crept in, which some readers won't find funny, but I was like chuckling away at the idea of someone like accidentally kicking a sausage roll. And so so that's how it kind of transformed.
I'd like to ask you where Alice comes from, because I think she's the one really sympathetic character in the book, and everything else seems to sort of radiate from her, their reaction or her reactions to them. Where did she come from?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think she's the heart of the novel, kind of the emotional heart. And I think she's one of the characters who, I started with Celia. She was the first character I had, and I was really interested in her. But the kind of warmth in the book, because Celia, I'm not sure you'd want to read an entire novel from Celia's perspective, because I think that'll be quite a cold experience. And I wanted in some ways a kind of foil to Celia, that kind of warmth and that real concern for other people, that care for other people's feelings. So she partly emerged because I thought what an interesting contrast to have a daughter to that mother, and also as a foil for Hannah, who's again the sort of cooler twin, who's maybe got more of a sense of self-preservation, or in some ways quite fragile. And I think I gave Alice some of my own people-pleasing tendencies and my more extreme sort of socially awkward moments, I thought. And also, she's a good source for comedy in some ways, I thought, because she's going to bumble into a lot of awkward situations and she's really going to mind about it. So I think she emerged from those concerns. And I also I think my characters generally come fairly unconsciously, that I just start writing and see what emerges, and if I like it then I'll carry on, and if I don't then I'll scrap it and start again. And she just kind of emerged, and I really enjoyed writing her character, so I persevered, and she kind of took up more and more space in the book.
And she was multifaceted, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Can you tell us anything about what you're working on now with your new book?
Sure, yeah. It's set in a boarding school in the 1980s, and the girls start to fall ill mysteriously, and then it's a sort of question of what's going on. Are they being poisoned? Is there something else? Is there a virus? And there's a sort of neurologist investigating, but a lot of it's from the point of view of one of the girls and one of the teachers. So it's a sort of comedy. I'd say it's a comedy again, but with some darker material too. And I wanted to look at a sort of closed community, like a closed environment. So our fathers are set on a very remote island in the Hebrides. So that's another kind of closed community. And my second novel, The Followers, is set in a cult on the Yorkshire moors. My first novel is just set within one small family, and it doesn't quite move about as much as I'm Sorry You Feel That Way. So I think I'm Sorry You Feel That Way has been more expansive than my other novels, because generally I like those kind of closed environments under pressure. I find that quite interesting. So I've picked a boarding school for this, and I've also taught for a while in a boarding school, so I kind of am familiar and fascinated by the weirdness of them. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. I'm about halfway through, I think. It's a bit of a mess at the moment, but I'm just at that stage where I'm moving from despair to starting to see how it might come together. I'm meant to deliver it sometime next year.
I'd just like to say, I shall forever thank you for the ferret.
Oh, thank
That's going to be the thing. Anybody says, do you want to come to a party? Will there be a ferret?
I hope there will be.
And the whole process of writing, especially now, this last book has been quite successful, very successful, really. Do you find it stressful?
Oh, that's interesting. It's not particularly. I mean, I think writing my current one, I maybe feel a little bit more pressure than previously. because I'm Sorry You Feel That Way what has been quite successful, which is uncharacteristic for me, and it's been far more successful, and the sales have been way better than my previous books. And a lot of people, we were talking about this before, that even people in publishing have congratulated me on having such a successful debut. But it's like my fourth novel, it's not my debut. Just because my other books have, they got good reviews, but the sales were modest, my agent says euphemistically. So I think in some ways that was actually, it's been quite a grind, because I've been writing for... My first novel was published when I was 25, and I wrote it when I was 23, and I'm 35 now. So I've been kind of grinding away for a while with, again, like pretty decent reviews, but really very rubbish sales until this one. And that's been kind of demoralising at times, but actually I can see now with a bit more insight, and with finally a successful novel under my belt as well, that it's been quite a gift for me, because it's allowed me to change direction so many times, because there's really been no pressure on what I was writing next any time, because my 3 readers might be kind of eagerly awaiting my next book, but nobody else is. And I don't think I would have got away with so many direction changes if my first novel had been really successful, or my second even. So I think, particularly the change of direction between Our Fathers and I'm Sorry You Feel That Way, moving into writing a comedy, albeit I think there's quite a lot in common, because there's a little bit of dark humour in Our Fathers, but it's a much bleaker book. But there's quite a lot of bleak material in I'm Sorry You Feel That Way as well. So I think you'd probably read it and know it was by the same writer, probably. But I don't think I would have got away with moving from that book to I'm Sorry You Feel That Way if I had more of an audience established already. Whereas now, I think I do have more readers after I'm Sorry You Feel That Way. So there's slightly more of a sense that there are people waiting for my next book, and that my publisher is going to market it as the next book from the author I'm Sorry You Feel That Way. So I'm kind of feeling that pressure belatedly at this quite late point in my career. But in some ways it's nice. It's really nice to be writing a book and knowing that there's like a fighting chance that some people will actually read it. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts, I guess. But it felt pretty depressing at points over the last 10 years, kind of writing another book, having it published, and not many people buying it. That is depressing for a writer. And I'm lucky that I've always had another job alongside, so I've never been worried about the money side of things. But I don't know if I would change that trajectory now, actually, because I think it's allowed me to write the exact books I wanted to write, which is a freedom that success might not have allowed me. But yeah, I hope that my next book turns out okay and isn't a crushing disappointment to people.
Final question I have to ask. Favourite and or most impactful book that you've enjoyed or read?
Oh, interesting. There's lots of books that have had an impact on me, and it sort of depends in different ways and at different times. I'm a big fan of Kate Atkinson, and I think she's a really good example of someone who can really move you whilst also writing books that just, are very readable and very funny, but without being dumbed down at all. Like, I think she's a very serious writer and experimental and interesting, but she makes it look so easy. So if I ever kind of lose sense of what I'm doing, I try to think, what would Kate Atkinson do? So I find her quite useful kind of template. I really like Pat Barker. I've been reading her for years and years. There's a writer called Alison Flood, who's not very famous, no one's heard of, but she wrote this novel called The Lighthouse, which is very odd and economical, and I think didn't sell that well, although it was on the Booker shortlist. And that's a really good example of doing something really quite different to what everyone else is doing, and writing a really short book, which publishers are always quite wary of because they say they won't sell. I think admittedly it didn't sell that well, but she is so economical with what she withholds from the reader. I found that a really good lesson in trusting your reader and not giving them too much information, but trusting them to kind of fill in
kind of like Claire Keegan.
Yes, yeah, a bit like Claire Keegan. Yeah, she does something similar, and I guess more successfully. And actually Claire Keegan, I would name as someone who I think is I don't write like Claire Keegan, sadly, but again, a really good reminder about trusting your reader and not doing all the work for them.
Yes, you do that brilliantly, I have to say. I can't stand books that tell me how to feel.
Yeah, and part of that, I think, is learning to be a good editor of your own work. So you will always write too much in the first draft. You will give too much information. But then when you go back and edit, you cut and cut and cut, and you put in those gaps, which I think that good fiction needs, that the reader will then fill.
Great. I think we're up for time. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.